Dostoevsky was not merely a novelist. He was an anatomist of the human soul, and he cut deeper than most philosophers ever dared. Long before psychology gave names to inner fracture, addiction, guilt, repression, and spiritual despair, he had already exposed them in their rawest form. He saw that the real battlefield of human life is not outside us but within us. It is the place where freedom collides with fear, where reason fails to govern desire, and where the longing for faith wrestles with the temptation to destroy. What makes Dostoevsky terrifyingly relevant is this: his philosophy was not built in the safety of abstraction. It was forged in suffering. Poverty, imprisonment, the mock execution, the years in Siberia, the constant proximity to humiliation and death, all of this stripped away illusion. What remained was a vision of the human being in its naked truth. He did not write to entertain, he wrote to reveal. He did not decorate pain, he forced it to speak. And what did he discover? He discovered that man does not always want peace, even when peace is offered. He may choose chaos simply because chaos proves that he is free. He discovered that evil is not a monster living far away in history or politics. It begins in the secret compromises of the heart. He discovered that suffering, though unbearable, can become the place where the soul is confronted, broken, and remade. Above all, he discovered that faith, love, and moral responsibility are not sentimental comforts. They are demands. They require a human being to stand naked before truth. That is why Dostoevsky still haunts the modern mind. The questions he raised have not disappeared. They have only become harder to escape. And to enter his world is to enter a philosophy that does not flatter human nature, but exposes it chapter by chapter, wound by wound, choice by choice. Freedom is not a blessing first. It is a burden. It is not the soft privilege modern language likes to celebrate, not the decorative word printed in constitutions or shouted in public squares. In Dostoevsky, freedom is something far more dangerous. It is the naked power to choose when no excuse is left. It is the terrible fact that the human being is not merely pushed by instinct, not merely arranged by society, not merely programmed by reason, but forced to stand before possibility and answer for what he does with it. Long before modern psychology began dissecting the fractured will, long before political theory reduced liberty to rights and institutions, Dostoevsky had already seen the deeper wound. He saw that freedom is metaphysical before it is social. It lives deeper than law. It cuts beneath economics. It enters the soul before it enters the state. When the world still wanted to believe that man could be explained by conditions, by education, by utility, by progress, he exposed a darker truth. Man is not only the creature who can choose the good, he is also the creature who can choose against his own good, against reason, against peace, even against himself. That is where Dostoevsky becomes unbearable. He strips away the comforting lie that evil is always a mistake of environment. He refuses the sentimental fantasy that given enough prosperity, enough order, enough rational design, man will naturally become decent. No. The human being can destroy what benefits him. He can wound what he loves. He can reject what saves him. And that ability is not an accident at the edge of existence. It is evidence of freedom at the center of existence. This is why freedom in Dostoevsky is not innocence. It is exposure. To be free means that no system can fully absorb your guilt. No theory can completely excuse your betrayal. No structure can finally carry your conscience for you. The modern mind wants causes because causes reduce shame. It wants mechanisms because mechanisms reduce responsibility. But Dostoevsky demands something harsher. He demands that we confront the scandal that a person may know, may understand, may even foresee the ruin ahead, and still choose it. What are you supposed to do with a being like that? What kind of civilization can ever feel secure when the human heart contains the power to sabotage itself on purpose? This is why his vision of freedom is inseparable from the possibility of both holiness and crime. A creature that can only do good is not moral. It is obedient. A creature that cannot betray is not virtuous. It is limited. Goodness matters only where refusal is possible. Love matters only where cruelty is available. Faith matters only where denial can be chosen. The dignity of man, in this vision, is terrible because it includes the capacity to fall. And the proof of that dignity is not that man rises easily, but that he stands at the edge of the abyss with both doors open. Dostoevsky understood this not as abstraction, but as lived reality. His life had already burned away any cheap trust in the smooth logic of progress. He had seen punishment, humiliation, despair, and the extremity of inner conflict. From that furnace emerged a philosophy written not in formulas, but in souls. His novels do not lecture from outside life. They descend into the courtroom of conscience. Every major figure becomes a battleground where freedom is tested. Not freedom as slogan, but freedom as torment. Not freedom as comfort, but freedom as decision under moral pressure. The crucial point is this: human freedom is revealed most clearly, not when people choose what is reasonable, but when they choose what is irrational. That sounds offensive to the modern ear because modernity wants coherence. It wants behavior to be explainable. It wants man to be manageable. Yet Dostoevsky saw that the impulse to act against interest is not a glitch in the machine. It is the sign that man is not a machine. He may choose what humiliates him simply because he cannot bear being reduced to calculation. He may reject happiness offered on rational terms because he senses that a life designed entirely by necessity is not truly his. Even self-destruction can become, in twisted form, a declaration of metaphysical independence. This does not make destruction noble. Dostoevsky never flatters ruin. He reveals its meaning. He forces us to admit that the will is not a servant of comfort. There is pride in suffering. There is vanity in rebellion. There is a perverse intoxication in choosing the path that proves no external law has total control over me. The human being would sometimes rather perish than be reduced to an obedient animal fed by perfect systems. That is not wisdom. It is not virtue, but it is freedom. And freedom does not guarantee light. It only guarantees that the soul can answer to light or spit in its face. Here the moral problem becomes severe. If man is free in this radical sense, then evil cannot be dismissed as mere error. It must be treated as participation. A person is not always swept into darkness by ignorance alone. Often he collaborates. He yields in increments. He rehearses compromise. He makes one small inward surrender, then another, until the soul has trained itself to prefer distortion over truth. Evil begins not only in grand crimes, but in quiet permissions granted inside the self. That is why Dostoevsky's world feels so psychologically exact. Catastrophe does not appear from nowhere. It ripens in secret consent. And what makes this terrifying is that the same structure applies to the good. Grace also requires consent. Love also requires choice. Redemption cannot be mechanically installed in the soul any more than corruption can. No one can be forced into moral beauty. No institution can automate purity. No ideology can manufacture a conscience. The person must answer. The person must will. The person must step toward the good while knowing he is equally capable of stepping away. Freedom, therefore, becomes the condition of both damnation and salvation. It is the wound through which either death or transformation enters. Modern man still resists this. He has simply become more sophisticated in the art of denial. Today, we hide from freedom, not by rejecting the word, but by emptying it. We call consumption freedom. We call preference freedom. We call the endless multiplication of options freedom. But options are not the core issue. The soul can drown in options and never become free. Real freedom begins where the self can no longer hide behind appetite, fashion, tribe, or system. It begins where one must ask not what is available, but what is right. Not what feels affirming, but what is true. Not what protects the ego, but what the conscience can bear. And here the modern condition may be even worse than the world Dostoevsky diagnosed. We possess more distraction, more explanation, more language for trauma, more theories of behavior, more techniques of self-management, and yet the central terror remains untouched. We still do not want responsibility proportionate to our power. We still want innocence without discipline. We still want moral authority without self-accusation. We still want to blame structures for what our own secret will has welcomed. Modernity did not solve the problem of freedom. It only built more elegant shelters from it. Dostoevsky reveals that beneath much of human anxiety lies not merely fear of suffering, but fear of choosing. Because to choose truly is to kill the fantasy that someone else authored my soul. It is to admit that I am implicated in what I become. It is to stand without anesthesia before the fact that my life is not only something that happens to me, it is also something I answer for. This is why freedom feels heavy. It demands inward adulthood. It demands that the self stop performing innocence and begin confronting complicity. A figure like Raskolnikov demonstrates this with brutal clarity. He is not simply a criminal mind or a social victim or an intellectual casualty. He is a consciousness trying to use theory to authorize transgression, trying to prove that the will can step over moral law and remain sovereign. Through him, Dostoevsky shows that freedom severed from moral truth does not create greatness, it creates disintegration. The self that tries to become God by placing itself above good and evil does not rise, it fractures. Pride first intoxicates, then isolates, then devours. The punishment is not only legal, it is ontological. The soul becomes foreign to itself. That is why Dostoevsky never treats freedom as license. Freedom without moral gravity becomes chaos. Freedom without conscience becomes cruelty. Freedom without humility becomes self-worship. But the answer is not to abolish freedom in favor of order. That temptation is just as deadly. The answer is to understand that freedom reaches its highest form not when it has no limits, but when it willingly aligns itself with truth, love, and sacrifice. Only then does liberty stop being merely the power to choose and become the power to choose well. This is the knife edge of Dostoevsky's philosophy. Man is exalted and endangered by the same gift. He can descend lower than the beast because he can corrupt himself knowingly. He can rise higher than instinct because he can choose love when hatred is easier. Freedom, therefore, is not the guarantee of human greatness. It is the arena in which greatness or ruin becomes possible. And every attempt to erase this tension, whether through political control, rational utopia, psychological reduction, or spiritual laziness, ends in falsehood. So the real question is not whether freedom is good. The real question is whether we can endure what freedom reveals about us. Can we bear a vision of the human being that includes both sanctity and atrocity in the same heart? Can we face the fact that the capacity for self-betrayal is not outside us, but within us? Can we admit that the hand that reaches toward light is attached to the same soul that can choose darkness with full awareness? Dostoevsky does not let us escape. He does not soothe. He confronts. He demands that we look directly at the terrible grandeur of being human. And once that door is opened, another problem emerges with even more violence, because the soul that is free does not remain whole for long. It begins to split under the pressure of its own consciousness, and from that fracture there appears a new figure, one who thinks too much, feels too sharply, despises himself too clearly, and can no longer move without colliding with the weight of his own mind. And that fractured consciousness has a face. It is the underground man. He is not an exception hidden in literature. He is the human mind when self-awareness becomes poison. He is what appears when consciousness turns inward too long, cuts too deep, and loses the ability to return to life without suspicion. Dostoevsky did not invent him as a curious psychological oddity. He revealed him as a permanent possibility inside modern man. Before psychiatry gave names to alienation, before modern culture glorified irony and detachment, Dostoevsky had already seen the creature born from excessive inwardness. He saw a man who thinks until action collapses, who analyzes until desire rots, who feels himself split between impulse and judgment until both become sterile. The underground man is not merely intelligent. That would be too simple. He is overconscious. And overconsciousness in Dostoevsky is not enlightenment. It is paralysis. It does not free the self. It chains the self to endless internal commentary. Every motive is examined, then doubted, then mocked. Every possible action is contaminated by anticipation. Every emotion is observed before it can be lived. He does not simply experience humiliation. He watches himself being humiliated. He does not simply desire revenge. He dissects the vanity inside revenge, then despises himself for wanting it, then preserves the wound because the wound has become proof that he is still inwardly alive. This is the first brutal truth Dostoevsky exposes. Consciousness can deepen life, but after a certain point it can also devour life. Why does this happen? Because the self begins to divide against itself. There is the one who acts, and there is the one who watches the action. Then there is the one who judges the watcher, then the one who mocks the judge. At that point, the soul is no longer a center. It is a chamber of echoes. The underground man lives inside those echoes. He cannot move with wholeness because each movement is intercepted by another layer of interpretation. He cannot surrender to spontaneity because he suspects spontaneity is only vanity in disguise. He cannot trust sincerity because he sees the hidden demand for recognition behind it. He cannot even hate cleanly because his hatred quickly becomes self-hatred. This is not depth in the heroic sense. This is fragmentation. The mind becomes so sharp that it turns on its own hand. Dostoevsky understood that self-consciousness has a threshold beyond which it becomes disease. Modern culture still refuses this. It flatters introspection as though more reflection is always better. It praises emotional literacy, self-analysis, infinite verbalization of inner states. But what happens when the self becomes trapped in permanent interpretation? What happens when every impulse must pass through the tribunal of irony before it is allowed to exist? What happens when a human being becomes incapable of directness because directness feels naive? Then life is no longer lived. It is monitored. The underground man is the result of that monitoring. He does not fail to act because he lacks intelligence. He fails because intelligence has lost its proper place and become tyrannical. This is why he is so close to the modern soul. Today, people are flooded with analysis, commentary, self-diagnosis, performance of identity, endless internal and external mirrors. They do not merely think. They think about how they are thinking. They do not merely feel. They curate feeling. They do not merely suffer. They narrate suffering while it is happening and judge the quality of the narrative as it unfolds. This does not create freedom. It creates distance from one's own existence. It produces a strange condition in which a person is present to himself and absent from life at the same time. Dostoevsky saw that condition long before screens and algorithms intensified it. He saw that a consciousness with no resting place becomes hostile to reality itself. The underground man is also driven by resentment, but resentment in Dostoevsky is never a simple social reaction. It is metaphysical. He resents the world because the world refuses to align with his wounded demand for absolute recognition. He resents others because they appear less divided than he is. He resents natural laws because they impose limits he cannot negotiate with. He resents rational systems because they threaten to explain him. He resents his own longing because longing exposes dependence. In him we see a consciousness that would rather suffer in defiance than accept reality on terms not authored by itself. This is why his pain becomes precious to him. Pain gives him a dark, private kingdom. Pain proves that he cannot be fully absorbed into the smooth logic of ordinary life. That is one of Dostoevsky's most merciless insights. Human beings do not always seek healing. Sometimes they protect the wound because the wound has become identity. Sometimes they cling to humiliation because humiliation gives them a secret superiority over the cheerful and the practical. Sometimes they nourish grievance because grievance keeps the ego from collapsing into insignificance. The underground man embodies this perverse attachment. He does not only suffer, he cultivates suffering. He turns it into style, argument, defense, and addiction. He would rather remain injured than become simple, because simplicity feels like surrender. Simplicity feels like being conquered by the very reality he cannot forgive. This is why excessive self-awareness does not make him more truthful. It often makes him more deceptive. He sees too much to believe his own justifications, yet he still lives by them. He exposes the lies of society, but uses exposure itself as a shield. He mocks nobility, but secretly longs for it. He despises theatrical emotion, but performs contempt with theatrical precision. He is a divided consciousness, not because he has no access to truth, but because he has lost the power to inhabit truth. He can see sincerity from a distance and still be unable to enter it. He can identify moral beauty and still sabotage any movement toward it. Knowledge alone does not save him. In fact, knowledge becomes another instrument of self-obstruction. Here Dostoevsky attacks one of the most cherished illusions of modern intellectual life. We like to believe that clearer understanding naturally produces better living. We assume that if a person sees himself accurately enough, he will correct himself. But the underground man proves the opposite can happen. A person may perceive his disease with devastating clarity and still feed it. He may diagnose his pride and remain loyal to it. He may confess his pettiness and continue using it as emotional capital. Self-knowledge without transformation becomes another circle of hell. It intensifies shame without producing freedom. It reveals contradiction without resolving it, and after enough repetition, the self becomes exhausted by its own lucidity. This exhaustion matters, because paralysis is not passive. It has consequences. A person who cannot act with wholeness begins to decay inwardly. He postpones, he rehearses imaginary confrontations, he builds elaborate inner dramas, and then fails the smallest concrete test of life. He dreams of dignity while practicing avoidance. He fantasizes about decisive gestures while remaining trapped in inertia. Slowly, the gap between thought and action becomes intolerable, and from that gap comes disgust. First disgust toward others, then toward the world, then toward the self. The underground man is not simply inactive. He is being spiritually corroded by inactivity. Every delayed action becomes more evidence against his own worth. This is why overthinking is not a harmless habit. In Dostoevsky, it becomes an existential prison. The person who cannot stop analyzing eventually loses trust in his own capacity to begin. And beginning is everything. To live is to step into uncertainty without complete self-transparency. To love is to act before all motives are purified. To speak truth is to risk imperfection. But the underground mind demands impossible guarantees. It wants to act without exposure. It wants purity before commitment. It wants certainty before movement. Since life offers none of these, it retreats and calls retreat intelligence. Yet this intelligence is often fear, wearing the mask of sophistication. There is another cruelty in the underground condition. The person who is deeply divided can become incapable of receiving ordinary human connection. Kindness embarrasses him. Friendship threatens him. Love humiliates him because love is an invitation to be seen without control. The underground man does not merely lack connection. He defends himself against it. He interprets generosity as condescension. He hears insult in neutrality. He transforms affection into injury because injury is easier to manage than tenderness. Tenderness demands vulnerability. Vulnerability threatens the fortress of self-consciousness. So he remains isolated, and then uses isolation as proof that the world is false. This is the closed circuit of alienation. He creates the distance he condemns. And is that not one of the deepest modern illnesses? We claim to want intimacy, yet we fear exposure. We want to be known, but only under conditions we script. We want recognition without surrender. We want love without the humiliation of dependence. So we hide behind irony, behind analysis, behind detachment, behind endless qualification. The result is not strength, it is emotional exile. Dostoevsky understood that the self cannot be healed by sharper inwardness alone. It must break the spiral. It must risk contact. It must endure the shame of being finite, ordinary, and in need of others. That is what makes the underground man so unforgettable. He is not evil in the grand theatrical sense. He is more disturbing than that. He is inwardly decomposing under the pressure of his own divided awareness. He represents a form of suffering that is intensely modern because it does not come primarily from external chains. It comes from interior overdevelopment without moral integration. His prison is built from thought, pride, memory, fantasy, and resentment. No wall is visible, yet the captivity is real. Through him, Dostoevsky forces us to confront a terrible possibility. A human being can become too conscious to live and too proud to change, and yet the deeper sting lies here. This division does not remain private. A self split against itself begins to rebel against the very idea that reason can govern life. Once consciousness has become torment, the promise of rational order starts to feel not liberating, but insulting. The underground man begins to resist any system that claims to explain man too neatly, and in that resistance another conflict rises with force, because what is being challenged now is not only the wounded individual, but the entire modern faith that human beings can be arranged, predicted, and perfected by reason alone. What is being challenged now is not merely a theory of society. It is a false image of man. Dostoevsky saw with ruthless clarity that the greatest deception of rationalism is not that it thinks. The danger is that it thinks it has finished thinking. It reaches a neat conclusion about human nature, then builds a cage and calls it progress. It assumes that once desire is calculated, once pain is minimized, once material conditions are arranged with enough precision, the human being will finally become predictable, peaceful, and good. But Dostoevsky tears this fantasy apart at its foundation. Man is not a creature who lives by logic alone. He is deeper than logic, darker than logic, and often more defiant than logic can bear. Before modern systems theory, before social engineering became an intellectual ambition, before political ideologies promised to redesign life from the ground up, Dostoevsky had already identified the poison hidden inside that ambition. He saw that every project built on pure rational order carries a secret contempt for the soul. It reduces man to appetite, calculation, stimulus, and response. It assumes that if enough bread is distributed, enough security guaranteed, enough utility maximized, then the ancient drama of freedom, guilt, pride, and transcendence will simply dissolve. But it does not dissolve. It waits. It hardens. It returns with greater violence precisely because it has been denied. This is the central rebellion. Dostoevsky does not attack reason because he worships chaos. He attacks the worship of reason because reason is not God. It is a tool, not a throne. It can measure but not sanctify. It can organize but not redeem. It can explain sequences of behavior, but it cannot exhaust the mystery of why a human being sometimes destroys the very thing he claims to want. That is where rationalism fails. It keeps expecting the soul to obey the arithmetic of advantage. Yet the soul is not arithmetic. The soul contains pride, shame, longing, resentment, ecstasy, self-hatred, thirst for meaning, and the strange urge to prove freedom even by choosing pain. Dostoevsky understood that once man is reduced to rational self-interest, something essential is amputated. The theory sounds clean. It flatters the planner. It reassures the reformer. It promises that conflict can be solved by correct arrangement. But the promise itself is built on a lie. Human beings do not only seek benefit, they also seek significance. They do not only want comfort, they want dignity. They do not only want pleasure, they want the right to say yes or no from the center of their own being, even when the choice wounds them. Remove that right, and what remains may look orderly, but it will not be fully human. That is why Dostoevsky's critique cuts deeper than politics or economics. He is exposing a spiritual error. Rationalism treats the person as if he could be understood from the outside. It studies motive, predicts reaction, classifies behavior, then assumes the inner abyss has been conquered. But the abyss remains untouched. A person may receive every external condition needed for comfort and still revolt. Why? Because comfort is not the highest hunger of man. There is something in him that refuses to be completed by material satisfaction alone. There is something that would rather suffer as a free being than live peacefully as a managed object. This is where the rebellion becomes terrifying. The rational mind cannot tolerate irrational freedom because irrational freedom humiliates its dream of control. A man who chooses against his own interest is an insult to every closed system. He breaks the formula. He exposes the limits of prediction. He reveals that inside the human being there is a force not fully capturable by statistics, institutions, incentives, or theories of utility. Dostoevsky insists that this force is not marginal. It is central. It is the proof that man remains metaphysically dangerous. He cannot be fully explained because he is not merely an effect. He is also a chooser, and choice always carries the possibility of refusal. In Notes from Underground, this rebellion takes one of its sharpest forms. The underground man stands against the fantasy that human life can be built like a crystal palace of perfect rational transparency. That palace is not just architecture. It is an idol. It represents the dream of a world where every desire is measured, every conflict solved, every action guided by what is objectively beneficial. A world without contradiction, a world without mystery, a world without the stubborn ugliness of freedom. But the underground man despises it because he senses what such perfection would demand. It would demand the surrender of the one thing man guards even more fiercely than happiness, the right to desire foolishly, to err, to resist, to assert a will that is not entirely domesticated by reason. That insight remains devastating because it exposes a truth modern civilization still tries to evade. We keep imagining that human brokenness is mainly a technical problem. We think better systems, better education, better policy, better design, better optimization will cure the violence at the core of existence. Yet modern life, with all its data and coordination, has not produced a soul at peace. It has produced a soul more efficiently distracted, more thoroughly monitored, more expertly administered, but not redeemed, not purified, not reconciled. Material power has increased. Moral depth has not kept pace. Rational control has expanded. Inner fragmentation remains. Dostoevsky saw why. Rational systems can regulate behavior, but they cannot answer the question of why one should be good when goodness costs. They cannot explain why guilt burns even when no one sees. They cannot account for sacrifice that gains nothing tangible. They cannot justify love that endures pain without guarantee of return. The deepest movements of the human spirit are not reducible to utility. A mother who suffers for a child, a penitent who confesses without reward, a soul that refuses betrayal at great personal loss, these acts do not fit neatly into materialist logic. They reveal that man lives by meanings reason alone cannot generate. This is why materialism, in Dostoevsky, is not merely incomplete, it is dehumanizing. It tells man that he is fundamentally an arrangement of needs and forces. It strips transcendence from suffering. It empties conscience of sacred weight. It redefines desire as mechanism. But once man accepts himself as nothing more than a material process, something catastrophic follows. Moral responsibility begins to thin. Evil becomes pathology. Love becomes chemistry. Faith becomes weakness. Sacrifice becomes inefficiency. In the name of realism, the human being is hollowed out. He still eats, works, and calculates, but the vertical dimension of existence is gone. He no longer stands between beast and saint. He is flattened. Dostoevsky refuses that flattening with violent intensity. He insists that even the most degraded person still contains a mystery beyond explanation. Not because man is pure, he is not. Not because man is noble by default, he is not. But because man is spiritually structured for struggle. He is a battlefield, not a machine. He can descend into cruelty while still knowing he has betrayed something sacred. He can deny truth while still being haunted by it. He can worship power while secretly starving for grace. No materialist account fully captures this contradiction. The human being is too inwardly dramatic to fit inside mechanical theories without mutilation. Here the modern parallel becomes impossible to ignore. Today, rationalism has become more sophisticated, more seductive, and more invasive. It speaks through systems, platforms, metrics, algorithms, behavioral models, therapeutic frameworks, and productivity cultures. It tells us what attention should do, what emotion means, what choice can be nudged, what habit can be engineered. It offers endless convenience, endless personalization, endless prediction. But beneath the smoothness lies the same old fantasy, that if enough variables are managed, the human problem will yield. Yet it does not yield. Anxiety deepens, emptiness spreads. Meaning collapses under abundance. People become more connected in structure and more estranged in soul. Modernity did not defeat the underground. It digitized it, and still the human being rebels. He sabotages his health, his relationships, his future, his peace. He clings to habits he knows are ruining him. He chooses what degrades him because degradation at least feels chosen. He rejects sane order because sane order sometimes feels like spiritual suffocation when no deeper meaning supports it. This is the point rationalism never learns. A person will not live by coherence alone. He needs not only explanation, but purpose. Not only management, but moral orientation. Not only structure, but a reason to suffer without collapsing into nihilism. Dostoevsky also sees the political danger here with prophetic force. When a society begins to believe that human beings are basically manageable units of need and reason, it becomes easier to justify control. If man is only matter, then he can be arranged. If freedom is merely a source of disorder, then perhaps freedom should be narrowed for the sake of stability. If irrationality is the enemy, then perhaps the state, the ideology, or the enlightened elite must reshape the masses for their own good. That is how the worship of reason becomes cruelty. Not because reason itself is cruel, but because reason without humility starts to treat souls as objects of design. This is why Dostoevsky's rebellion against rationalism is also a defense of moral danger. That sounds harsh, because it is harsh. He would rather preserve the risk of freedom than accept a peace purchased by spiritual mutilation. He would rather face a humanity capable of sin than submit to a utopia where conscience has been replaced by programming. A perfect system that abolishes the possibility of inward struggle does not save man. It erases him. The human being becomes fully governable only when he is no longer fully human. And yet this rebellion is not a celebration of stupidity. Dostoevsky is not asking us to abandon thought, despise science, or romanticize impulse. He is doing something more difficult. He is demanding that reason know its rank. Reason must kneel before the full reality of the person. It must admit that there are dimensions of existence it cannot master. It must recognize conscience, freedom, suffering, evil, repentance, and love as realities that do not shrink to formula without remainder. Once reason forgets this, it becomes imperial. Once it becomes imperial, it begins to destroy what it cannot measure. The underground man senses this in distorted form. His rebellion is often bitter, petty, and self-injuring. But beneath the distortion is a genuine revelation. He knows that the demand to become perfectly rational is also a demand to become less alive. He resists because he wants to preserve the terrible unpredictability that belongs to human freedom. He would rather wound himself than disappear into a polished machine of necessity. His protest is diseased, but it is not meaningless. Through his spite, Dostoevsky exposes the hunger that rational systems cannot satisfy. The hunger not merely to function, but to matter. Not merely to survive, but to choose in a way that carries metaphysical weight. This is why every age that worships explanation eventually collides with darkness. For when man discovers that reason cannot justify his pain, cannot cleanse his guilt, cannot satisfy his longing, and cannot make him good by force, another truth begins to rise from below. It is darker, more intimate, more accusing. It no longer asks whether society can be perfected. It asks what lives inside the human heart when every system fails, when every explanation ends, and when the soul is left alone with its own capacity for destruction. And when every explanation ends, what remains is not a clean theory of evil. What remains is a human heart. That is Dostoevsky's most frightening revelation. Evil is not only in systems, not only in governments, not only in poverty, humiliation, or bad education. It is in the secret movement of the will. It is in the moment a person consents inwardly to what he already knows is beneath him. It is in the quiet permission the soul gives itself before any visible crime appears. Dostoevsky does not let us hide behind circumstance. He forces us to confront a harder truth. The darkest force in human life is often not imposed from outside. It rises from within. Long before modern psychology tried to classify aggression, trauma, and deviance, Dostoevsky had already gone lower than diagnosis. He entered the moral basement of the person. He saw that evil is not only an event, it is a process. It does not arrive fully formed. It prepares itself in thought, in vanity, in resentment, in self-justification, in one tolerated lie after another. When the world wanted to believe that crime could be solved by rearranging external conditions alone, he revealed that the criminal act is often born long before the hand moves. It begins in the imagination. It begins in the ego. It begins the moment the self decides that its pain gives it permission. This is where Dostoevsky becomes merciless. He strips away the flattering illusion that ordinary people stand far from evil. No, every person contains both capacities. The line between compassion and cruelty does not divide classes, nations, or ideologies first. It cuts through the individual soul. A man may speak of justice and still hunger for domination. A woman may speak of kindness and still nurture silent contempt. A respectable life may conceal violent fantasies, quiet cowardice, or moral laziness that would become monstrous under pressure. Dostoevsky does not say this to condemn humanity from above. He says it to destroy innocence as performance. He demands that we stop pretending darkness belongs only to others. The modern mind hates this because it ruins the comfort of moral distance. We prefer villains who look unlike us. We prefer evil that arrives with obvious marks. We prefer crimes that feel foreign. But Dostoevsky shows something far worse. Evil often wears intelligence, refinement, wounded sensitivity, even idealism. It does not always come growling. Sometimes it comes reasoning, sometimes it comes injured, sometimes it comes speaking the language of justice while quietly feeding on pride. That is why it is dangerous. What destroys the soul is rarely the first outrageous act. It is the first tolerated distortion of truth inside oneself. Crime, in Dostoevsky, is therefore never only legal. It is existential. A person commits the deepest betrayal before the law ever notices. He commits it when he chooses to stand above conscience. He commits it when he begins to speak inwardly as though he were exempt. He commits it when he turns suffering into entitlement and humiliation into moral license. At that point, something decisive has already happened. The soul has bent. The visible act may still be days or months away, but the inward order has already been broken. The crime on the street is only the final body of a crime that began in thought. Raskolnikov reveals this with savage precision. He does not kill because he is hungry alone. He does not kill because society failed him alone. Those conditions matter, but Dostoevsky is after something deeper. Raskolnikov wants to prove that he belongs to a higher category of being. He wants to step over the common moral law and remain sovereign. He wants to test whether conscience binds him or whether he can declare himself exceptional. The murder is not only an act of desperation, it is an experiment in metaphysical pride. Through him, Dostoevsky reveals that evil often begins where the ego no longer wants to obey the human limit. That is the core disease. Pride does not always look like arrogance on the surface. It can look like injury. It can look like bitterness. It can look like a wounded person telling himself that the world has wronged him so deeply that he now stands outside ordinary obligation. This is how the heart starts negotiating with darkness, not by denying good completely, but by creating special exemptions for the self. Just this once. Just for me. Just because my case is different. Just because my pain is greater. Just because no one understands what I have suffered. From there, the descent becomes possible. Dostoevsky understood that evil feeds on abstraction. The more a person stops seeing others as sacred realities and starts seeing them as functions, obstacles, symbols, or pieces in an argument, the easier destruction becomes. This is why crime often follows a prior act of conceptual coldness. Before one can harm another deeply, one usually reduces him inwardly. He becomes less a person than a problem, less a soul than a burden, less a face than an object inside my narrative. Once that reduction is accepted, compassion weakens. Once compassion weakens, violence no longer feels impossible. It begins to feel arguable. But the terrifying force of Dostoevsky lies here. He does not isolate this mechanism to murderers alone. He reveals it in ordinary moral life. Every time a person turns another into a tool for ego, status, revenge, or self-comfort, the same principle is present in smaller form. Every time we withdraw human dignity from someone because it is convenient, we rehearse the logic of evil. Every time we lie to preserve power over another, every time we enjoy another's humiliation, every time we protect our vanity by making someone else smaller, we participate in the same darkness in miniature. The scale differs. The structure does not. This is why he insists that crime begins in small compromises, not because every compromise leads to catastrophe in a straight line, but because each one trains the soul. A person becomes what he repeatedly permits. The first falsehood seems minor. The first act of contempt seems manageable. The first cowardice seems understandable, but repetition matters. What we excuse today becomes easier tomorrow. What shames us at first later becomes habit. Conscience dulls by degrees. The heart does not usually become monstrous in one leap. It becomes capable of monstrosity through practice. That is one of Dostoevsky's darkest psychological insights. The self does not need a grand doctrine of evil to collapse. It only needs sustained permission. One can descend through pettiness as surely as through brutality. Resentment held too long becomes identity. Envy fed too long becomes vision. Secret malice repeated too long becomes character. Then one day the person no longer feels he is betraying himself. He feels he is finally being honest about who he is. At that point, the corruption is advanced. The evil no longer appears as invasion. It appears as authenticity. Modern culture flatters authenticity without asking what is being made authentic. That is a fatal blindness. To be true to oneself is not virtue if the self has been shaped by vanity, grievance, lust for superiority, or addiction to injury. Dostoevsky would ask the question few want to face. What if the self you are trying to express is already diseased? What if your most sincere impulse is not your liberation, but your corruption? The heart is not innocent merely because it is personal. It must be judged. It must be purified. It must be confronted. Otherwise, authenticity becomes a ceremonial name for surrender. This is also why Dostoevsky never lets suffering excuse evil. He knows suffering can deepen compassion, humility, and truth, but he also knows it can curdle. A wounded soul can become more tender or more cruel. Pain does not sanctify automatically. It intensifies whatever the will does with it. One person suffers and becomes merciful because he has learned what it means to be fragile. Another suffers and becomes merciless because he has decided the world now owes him blood. The The same wound can become the birthplace of grace or of vengeance. That choice is where moral seriousness begins. Stavrogin embodies another dimension of this darkness. In him we see not hot desperation, but cold spiritual ruin. He is not driven by one simple passion. He is emptied by the loss of moral center itself. Through figures like him, Dostoevsky shows that evil can become elegant, bored, refined, and almost weightless. It does not always roar. Sometimes it yawns. Sometimes the most dangerous soul is the one who no longer feels the reality of good or evil with living intensity. Once the conscience goes numb, transgression can become amusement, and amusement in a deadened soul may be more terrifying than rage in a living one. This should wound the modern reader because numbness is everywhere. We are flooded with images of suffering and trained to remain half-moved. We witness humiliation at scale and metabolize it as content. We learn to discuss cruelty fluently while remaining inwardly untouched. That condition is not neutrality. It is corrosion. A heart that no longer trembles before the reality of another's pain is already in danger. Evil does not require theatrical hatred. Sometimes it requires only the successful removal of reverence. Dostoevsky therefore drives us back to conscience, but not conscience as social politeness. He means something deeper and more severe. Conscience is the inward knowledge that I am answerable for what I permit myself to become. It is the refusal to let intelligence dissolve responsibility. It is the refusal to let suffering become entitlement. It is the refusal to let abstraction erase the face of another human being. Without this, the person starts drifting toward inner lawlessness long before any visible collapse. And once inner lawlessness takes root, outward destruction is only a matter of opportunity. That is why the struggle against evil is not primarily a public performance. It is hidden first. It happens in thought before speech, in motive before action, in interpretation before decision. It happens when no one applauds. It happens when the self must decide whether it will nourish contempt or resist it, indulge self-pity or purify it, weaponize pain or carry it without poisoning others. This hidden struggle is where character is formed. This is where saints and criminals begin to diverge while still looking outwardly alike. And still Dostoevsky refuses simplification. He knows that no one is made of clean categories. The same person may carry tenderness and malice, generosity and vanity, longing for God and appetite for destruction. The human heart is not a courtroom where one voice speaks. It is a battlefield where many desires fight for sovereignty. That is why moral life remains dramatic to the end. One can never assume the darkness is finished. It waits in pride, in exhaustion, in humiliation, in rationalization, in the hunger to strike back. The person who thinks himself safely beyond evil has already begun to lose the battle. So the question becomes unbearable. If darkness is this intimate, if crime grows from compromises so small they can hide inside ordinary life, if the soul can educate itself into cruelty while still speaking the language of reason, then what hope remains for innocence at all? And that question sharpens with a special violence when the gaze turns away from the guilty and lands on those who have made no bargain with evil, those who did not choose the wound, those whose suffering arrives before freedom is even mature enough to answer for anything. And that is where innocence becomes an accusation against the world, not because innocence is weak, but because suffering reveals its deepest scandal when it falls upon those who have not yet built the inner architecture of guilt. Dostoevsky understood that the problem of pain becomes unbearable not when the wicked suffer, but when the blameless do. The sight of innocence under torment does not merely wound emotion. It shatters systems. It humiliates easy theology. It strips philosophy to the bone. For if existence contains meaning, then why does pain arrive where moral responsibility has not yet ripened? Why does the lash fall upon the child, the gentle, the defenseless, the soul that has not chosen cruelty and cannot yet answer for the world's crimes? Before modern debates turned suffering into abstract discourse, Dostoevsky had already entered the furnace of this question with naked seriousness. He did not treat pain as a puzzle to be solved elegantly. He treated it as a reality that stains every attempt to speak of justice without trembling. He saw that one can endure one's own suffering with many explanations. Pride can survive it, faith can reinterpret it, endurance can sanctify it. But the suffering of innocence is different. It does not remain contained inside the one who suffers. It rises as accusation. It confronts every witness. It asks whether the world is morally intelligible at all. This is why Ivan Karamazov becomes so devastating. He does not reject shallow religion. He rejects any moral accounting that dares to harmonize innocent suffering too quickly. Through him, Dostoevsky gives voice to one of the harshest revolts ever placed inside literature. Ivan does not say that evil is unfortunate. He says it is unacceptable when it crushes the innocent. He refuses the kind of metaphysical optimism that dares to imagine some future balance sheet capable of justifying a child's tears. He will not allow beauty, order, redemption, or eternal harmony to be purchased at that price. This is not childish rebellion. It is moral seriousness refusing consolation. That is why Ivan matters. He forces the reader into a place most systems avoid. He does not let us hide behind destiny, providence, historical necessity, or the vague promise that everything will make sense later. No, he drags the problem into the light where it cannot be softened. What sort of world allows innocence to be broken before it has even learned the full meaning of freedom? What kind of justice can permit a child to bear pain no doctrine would dare impose on a conscious criminal? If you answer too quickly, you reveal not wisdom, but insensitivity. If you solve the problem neatly, you have probably not entered it deeply enough. Dostoevsky's greatness lies in the fact that he does not silence this revolt. He lets it stand in full force. He gives it intelligence, moral gravity, and emotional legitimacy. He does not caricature doubt. He arms it. He allows the argument against cosmic order to become almost intolerably strong. That is important, because real faith that has never passed through this fire remains shallow. A belief untouched by the suffering of innocence is often only inherited language. It has not yet earned the right to speak. Dostoevsky knows that if truth exists, it must survive the most merciless question, not only the convenient one. And yet the issue goes deeper than theology. Innocent suffering destroys the fantasy that life is morally transparent. It reveals that existence is not arranged for our emotional comfort. It shows that the universe does not immediately display justice on the surface of events. The good are not always protected. Purity is not always spared. Gentleness does not guarantee shelter. This is why the suffering of innocence terrifies the human heart more than any punishment of the guilty. It reveals that vulnerability is built into existence itself. To live is to be exposed in a world where pain does not wait politely for guilt. Modern culture still cannot bear this. It either sentimentalizes innocence or weaponizes it. It displays suffering, comments on suffering, performs outrage about suffering, but rarely dwells with the metaphysical force of the question. We are flooded with images of pain, yet often remain spiritually shallow before it. We turn tragedy into narrative, into news, into debate, into ideology, into content. But Dostoevsky demands something far more difficult. He demands that we let innocent suffering break our systems open. Not so we can collapse into despair, but so we stop speaking as though existence has already been mastered. There is also a deeper psychological violence in innocent suffering. It does not only challenge belief in justice, it wounds the witness with helplessness. The sight of a child in pain or any defenseless soul under torment awakens a terrible contradiction. We feel that this should not be, yet our feeling does not stop it. We intuit moral outrage, yet reality proceeds without asking permission from our outrage. This creates a fracture inside consciousness. On one side stands our demand for justice. On the other stands the fact of what has happened. Between them emerges anguish. Not simple sadness, but anguish born from the collision between moral intuition and historical reality. Dostoevsky refuses to anesthetize that anguish. He knows that many people do not lose faith because they are seduced by pleasure or by argument alone. They lose it because they cannot reconcile the existence of innocence with the existence of cruelty. And the cruelty becomes even more unbearable when it appears unnecessary, excessive, humiliating, and directed at those with no power to answer it. At that point, suffering no longer feels like a test. It feels like desecration. It feels as though the moral fabric of existence itself has been torn. This is why the problem of innocence cuts deeper than the problem of guilt. Guilt at least fits inside the language of responsibility. Innocence does not. Guilt allows punishment to be imagined. Innocence exposes punishment as scandal. Guilt can still be narrated in moral categories. Innocence creates silence, protest, and sometimes blasphemy. The soul confronted by innocent suffering does not merely ask what law was broken. It asks whether law itself has failed, whether God is absent, whether meaning is a lie, whether love is only a local human dream projected onto an indifferent universe. Ivan gives form to that revolt, but he also exposes another truth. The human demand for justice is itself evidence of something profound. We do not react to innocent suffering as though it were neutral. We do not greet it with mere surprise. We experience it as wrong, not merely unpleasant, not merely regrettable, but wrong. That reaction matters. It reveals that the soul carries a measure deeper than survival. We are built to recognize violation. We are not content with brute fact. We judge it. We condemn it. Even in revolt, the moral structure of the person remains active. The very protest against innocent suffering proves that man longs for a justice reality does not yet visibly deliver. That longing becomes both wound and clue. It wounds because reality refuses to satisfy it on demand. It becomes a clue because the hunger for justice would be unintelligible in a world where value were entirely invented. Something in the human soul knows that innocence should not be crushed. That knowledge is not an argument yet, but it is not nothing. It is a sign that the heart is not designed to make peace easily with cruelty. It remains homesick for a moral order that history alone cannot provide. Still, Dostoevsky never allows this to harden into cheap reassurance. He knows that no philosophical inference erases tears, no doctrine returns stolen childhood, no future explanation can make the moment of torment feel acceptable when viewed honestly. The pain remains, the revolt remains, and any response that bypasses this is false. This is why he writes with such volcanic tension. He refuses both sentimental despair and sentimental hope. He keeps the wound open because the wound is real. He knows that to honor innocence, one must first refuse to explain away its suffering. Here the modern reader is exposed again. We want answers that function like emotional anesthesia. We want frameworks that allow us to remain spiritually composed. We want justice without mystery, grief without rupture, faith without scandal. But Dostoevsky demands the opposite. He demands that we enter the scandal fully. He demands that we feel the rebellion in our bones. He demands that we stand where the intellect can no longer dominate and where the heart is forced to speak with all its outrage, because only there does the question become real enough to deserve a real response. There is also a hidden danger in the spectacle of innocence harmed. The witness can become consumed not only by grief, but by vengeance. The pain of seeing the innocent violated can tempt the soul toward a new form of darkness. The desire to protect can turn into the desire to annihilate. The moral protest against suffering can become hatred so absolute that it begins to resemble the evil it opposes. Dostoevsky sees this, too. Outrage is not pure merely because its object is terrible. The heart that cannot bear innocence destroyed may itself be dragged toward destruction by the ferocity of its demand for justice. That is why innocent suffering becomes a crossroads. One path leads to nihilism. If innocence can be crushed, then perhaps all order is illusion and all value is fraud. Another path leads to rage. If innocence can be crushed, then perhaps only force matters and mercy is weakness. Another path leads to numbness. If the wound is too deep, the soul may stop feeling in order to survive. But none of these paths heal the scandal. They only change the form of the wound. The deeper question remains: how can one remain morally awake in a world where innocence bleeds? How can one continue to affirm value when reality seems to mock it? Dostoevsky does not answer that question with argument first. He prepares the ground by showing that any answer worthy of the wound must be personal, not merely conceptual. Innocent suffering cannot be met by a theory alone because the scandal is not abstract. It is relational. It concerns love, vulnerability, pity, and the unbearable intimacy of pain. A child's cry is not a proposition, it is a demand. It calls for presence before explanation, compassion before doctrine, and some form of shared burden before any metaphysical resolution can even begin to speak. This is where another kind of strength starts to appear in the Dostoevskian world, not the strength that explains from above, but the strength that descends. Not the voice that tidies suffering into meaning too quickly, but the soul willing to remain beside pain without fleeing into theory. This matters because the first ethical response to innocent suffering is not intellectual mastery. It is whether one can stay human in its presence, whether one can refuse indifference, whether one can protect tenderness from turning into hatred, whether one can carry another's wound without using it to worship one's own despair. And once that possibility appears, another figure begins to stand in the distance with a different kind of authority, not arguing against the revolt by denying its force, but answering it through a form of love that does not explain suffering away and does not retreat from it either. And that is where love ceases to be sentiment and becomes a form of moral power. Dostoevsky does not place hope in argument alone, because argument can expose the wound without healing the soul that bleeds from it. He knows that intelligence can diagnose despair and still leave a human being kneeling in the ruins of himself. What answers innocence violated, freedom corrupted, pride inflamed, and suffering unredeemed is not a cleaner theory. It is a different mode of being. It is the presence of a soul that does not dominate, does not flatter, does not retreat, and does not lie. In Dostoevsky, that soul finds one of its clearest forms in Prince Myshkin, and through him a brutal truth emerges. Purity is not weakness. It is one of the rarest and most dangerous forces in a broken world. Before modern culture learned to confuse gentleness with passivity, before cynicism became fashionable and suspicion was mistaken for depth, Dostoevsky had already shown how difficult real goodness is. He knew that the world does not fear innocence, because innocence is naive. The world fears innocence because innocence exposes corruption without needing to shout. A truly pure presence reveals the hidden violence of those around it. It does not need to accuse. It unveils. It does not need to overpower. It forces others to see what they have become. That is why the holy figure in Dostoevsky is never merely decorative. He is explosive. He destabilizes entire moral environments simply by existing without the usual compromises. Prince Mishkin matters because he enters a world structured by vanity, appetite, calculation, wounded pride, erotic obsession, and spiritual fatigue, and he does not answer it with the same weapons. He does not manipulate. He does not harden himself into superiority. He does not reduce others to instruments. He meets suffering with attention. He meets degradation with pity. He meets cruelty without adopting cruelty as his method. This does not make him socially effective in the ordinary sense. In fact, it makes him appear absurd. But that absurdity is exactly the point. The good, when it appears in a corrupted world, often looks ridiculous before it looks authoritative. The pure soul seems weak only to those who have already accepted contamination as the price of adulthood. Dostoevsky understood that most people do not reject goodness because they have disproved it. They reject it because goodness humiliates them. A person built on vanity can tolerate condemnation more easily than compassion. Why? Because condemnation confirms conflict, and conflict preserves pride. But compassion penetrates deeper. Compassion says that beneath the masks, beneath the performances, beneath the sin and the self-defense, there remains something worth grieving over. That is unbearable to the hardened soul because it threatens the identity built on bitterness. To be loved without first being justified is often more painful than being hated. Hatred lets the ego fight back. Love demands exposure. This is why Mishkin is not simply a nice man. He is a psychological and spiritual threat to everyone who depends on deception. His presence reveals the poverty of worldly intelligence. Others around him know how to maneuver, seduce, strategize, and dominate. They know the codes of social power. They know how to wound and how to protect themselves from being wounded. But Mishkin sees something they cannot see without pain. He sees the suffering beneath the performance. He sees the terrified human being inside the theatrical self. He sees that much of what appears as arrogance is often despair in armor. That vision is not weakness. It is a form of higher realism. Modern culture has almost lost the capacity to understand such realism. It believes that seeing the worst in people is maturity. It believes suspicion is intelligence. It treats tenderness as gullibility and mercy as lack of boundaries. But Dostoevsky reverses this. He shows that cynicism often comes not from wisdom, but from moral exhaustion. The cynical person claims to see clearly because he expects corruption everywhere. But that expectation can itself become blindness. He becomes incapable of perceiving grace, repentance, fragility, or the remnants of innocence in another person. He calls this lucidity. In truth, it is often despair disguised as sophistication. Mishkin reveals another standard. To perceive suffering without immediately converting it into contempt requires strength. To remain undefended before another person's pain requires strength. To refuse the intoxication of superiority requires strength. Dostoevsky is relentless on this point. The strongest soul is not the one most capable of domination. It is the one least enslaved by the need to dominate. The strongest person is the one who can remain inwardly clean while standing in the middle of corruption. Not untouched in the sense of distance, but unstained in the sense of moral refusal. And yet Dostoevsky never sentimentalizes this purity. He knows the pure soul in a fallen world will suffer terribly. Goodness does not float above the mud untouched. It enters the mud and feels its full weight. Mishkin is not protected from tragedy by his innocence. On the contrary, his innocence places him in direct collision with forces more brutal than himself. Desire misreads him. Pride resents him. Chaos swallows the fragile spaces where love might have taken root. This matters because Dostoevsky refuses a childlike fantasy in which moral beauty automatically triumphs in visible history. It does not. Purity can be wounded. Compassion can be overwhelmed. The saint can stand in the room, and the room may still choose ruin. That is what makes this vision so severe. Goodness is not guaranteed worldly victory. It is guaranteed exposure to suffering. The soul that refuses compromise becomes acutely vulnerable in a world built on compromise. The heart that remains open feels every wound more sharply. The person who truly pities others will carry grief others avoid by remaining cold. This is why many people choose hardness. Hardness reduces pain. Hardness creates distance. Hardness gives control. But it also amputates the very capacity that makes one human in the fullest sense. To protect oneself completely from suffering is to protect oneself from love as well. Here Dostoevsky reaches one of his deepest psychological truths. Human beings often prefer being powerful to being pure because purity requires surrender of the ego. Power lets the self preserve itself. Purity demands that the self stop worshipping itself. Power lets me arrange the world around my need. Purity forces me to encounter another person as real beyond my need. This is why genuine goodness feels almost supernatural in ordinary life. It contradicts the dominant impulse of the ego. It refuses the constant hunger to secure status, comfort, recognition, and advantage. It lives by another law, and that law cannot be reduced to utility. Nastasia Philippovna makes this even more tragic. She is not merely a dramatic figure moving through chaos. She is a soul so wounded by humiliation that she can no longer believe in her own worth. Through her, Dostoevsky shows one of the most devastating consequences of violated innocence. A person can become so identified with shame that mercy itself feels intolerable. She does not only suffer from what has been done to her, she suffers from the internalization of desecration. She begins to live as though ruin is the only truth left about her. This is what evil does when it goes deep enough. It not only harms the person, it persuades the person to participate in the verdict against herself. Mishkin confronts that verdict not with doctrine, but with recognition. He sees her as human where others see scandal, temptation, or social contamination. That act of seeing is already redemptive in structure, even if it does not produce visible rescue. Dostoevsky is saying something merciless here. Many people are not destroyed only by pain. They are destroyed by the absence of a gaze that refuses to reduce them to the pain. To be seen truthfully and yet not discarded is one of the rarest forms of grace. It does not erase history. It does not magically restore innocence. But it interrupts the lie that degradation is the final definition of a soul. And still, even this grace encounters resistance. The wounded often cannot receive love cleanly because love threatens the identity formed around injury. If I am nothing but my wound, then healing feels like annihilation. If I have built myself around my humiliation, then mercy destabilizes the only self I know. This is why redemption is never sentimental in Dostoevsky. It demands a death inside the ego. It requires the person to release the dark familiarity of self-hatred. It asks the sufferer not only to be pitied, but to accept the terrifying possibility that he or she is still capable of another life. That possibility can be more frightening than despair. This is also why the figure of holy innocence in Dostoevsky cannot remain merely private. Such innocence becomes judgment on an entire civilization. A society that mocks purity reveals its exhaustion. A culture that sexualizes innocence, commercializes tenderness, and treats compassion as weakness reveals that it has lost the ability to recognize moral beauty. It may still function, it may still innovate, entertain, and organize, but inwardly it is starving. It can no longer distinguish strength from aggression or depth from cynicism. It confuses hardness with intelligence because it no longer remembers what incorruptibility looks like. The modern parallel is brutal. We live in an age that teaches performance before sincerity, irony before reverence, self-protection before sacrificial presence. People learn early how to brand themselves, defend themselves, and narrate themselves. Very few learn how to remain morally transparent without becoming performative. Very few learn how to care without secretly converting care into identity. Very few learn how to stand near suffering without making themselves the center of the scene. In such a world, a figure like Mishkin does not merely seem strange, he seems almost impossible. And that impossibility is itself an indictment of us. Dostoevsky pushes further. He suggests that holiness is not first a matter of moral flawlessness in a shallow sense. It is a mode of seeing and bearing. The holy soul carries the burden of other people without immediately turning it into accusation or control. The holy soul refuses to deny evil, yet also refuses to become fascinated by evil. That is crucial. Many people who claim realism are secretly addicted to darkness. They study corruption with a kind of appetite. They become connoisseurs of decay. But the truly pure person looks at evil only as much as necessary to answer it with truth and pity. He does not feed on it. He does not make it his identity. He remains oriented toward the wounded person rather than the spectacle of the wound. That orientation reveals why purity is linked to sacrifice. To love truly in a Dostoevskian world is to accept loss. It is to let another person's reality enter my own peace and disturb it. It is to reject the efficient logic of self-preservation. It is to risk misunderstanding, humiliation, exhaustion, and grief. This is why love in his world is never decorative. It costs. It bleeds. It places the soul in danger of being broken by what it refuses to abandon. Yet, without this risk, human life collapses into calculation, and calculation cannot redeem anything. So the question becomes sharper now. If innocent suffering has accused the world, and pure love has appeared not as theory but as a living contradiction to corruption, then what remains is to ask whether such love can do more than reveal. Can it endure the full pressure of evil, guilt, shame, and revolt without collapsing? Can compassion remain standing where pride, reason, and innocence have all been torn open? Can there be a form of spiritual life strong enough not merely to pity the broken, but to carry them toward transfiguration without denying one grain of the darkness they contain? And that is the final threshold before redemption stops being a beautiful idea and becomes a terrifying demand. Dostoevsky never believed that compassion alone, in its sentimental form, could carry the full weight of the human abyss. Pity can tremble before suffering. It can even remain near suffering. But the deeper question is whether love can survive contact with guilt, not innocence wounded, not pain undeserved, guilt, corruption, defilement. The soul that has not only suffered, but consented to darkness, the soul that has betrayed, lied, degraded, and turned against its own conscience. Can such a soul still be born without being excused? Can it still be loved without moral truth being destroyed? That is where Dostoevsky drives the knife deeper. He refuses every cheap answer. Redemption is not tolerance. It is not indulgence. It is not the modern ritual of explaining sin until sin disappears into context. Dostoevsky does not soften evil to make mercy easier. He intensifies evil so that mercy, if it appears, will carry real weight. A forgiveness that overlooks nothing is the only forgiveness that matters. A love that requires false innocence is not redemption. It is theater. The real question is whether the human being can be faced in his full contradiction and not be abandoned. Can someone stand before a soul that is both wounded and guilty, both victim and participant, both longing for light and addicted to darkness, and still say that the story is not over? This is why the path toward transformation in Dostoevsky is always narrow and violent. The self does not drift into renewal. It must be broken open. Pride must collapse. Self-justification must exhaust itself. The person must arrive at the place where no theory protects him from himself anymore. This is not cruelty. It is purification. As long as a human being can still decorate his corruption, he will not seek truth. As long as he can still romanticize his suffering, he will not surrender the ego hidden inside it. As long as he can still blame everyone else without remainder, he will not reach the terrible freedom of confession. Confession in Dostoevsky is not a social gesture. It is metaphysical exposure. It is the moment the soul stops negotiating with falsehood. It is the refusal to remain divided. The guilty person does not become clean by denying what he has done. He becomes capable of truth by standing inside it without disguise. That act is unbearable because the ego survives by distortion. It edits, it rationalizes, it selects flattering angles. But confession strips all that away. It forces the self to see that the real prison was never only punishment from outside, it was the inner architecture of lies required to avoid seeing what one had become. This is why characters like Sonia matter with such frightening force. She does not redeem by argument. She redeems by bearing witness without retreating from truth. She does not call evil good. She does not baptize corruption as complexity. She sees the crime, the shame, the degradation, and still remains present. That presence is revolutionary because it joins moral clarity with compassion. One without the other destroys. Clarity without compassion crushes. Compassion without clarity decays into sentimentality. Sonia holds both. She stands near guilt without becoming contaminated by it, and near suffering without becoming intoxicated by it. In her, Dostoevsky shows that love becomes redemptive only when it refuses both lies at once. That is the challenge modern culture still cannot endure. We split in opposite directions. Some worship judgment because judgment gives the ego the pleasure of superiority. Others worship acceptance because acceptance gives the ego the pleasure of appearing merciful without demanding change. Dostoevsky rejects both evasions. He wants a love severe enough to tell the truth and deep enough not to flee after telling it. He wants a compassion that does not flatter self-deception. He wants a moral vision in which the sinner is neither demonized nor excused, but summoned. Summoned to what? To the death of the false self. And that death is the real terror. People speak easily of becoming better, healing, growing, moving on. Dostoevsky speaks of something harsher. He speaks of resurrection. And resurrection always implies a grave. Something in the old self must end. The self built on grievance, vanity, appetite for control, secret worship of humiliation, addiction to being wronged, pride in suffering, fascination with transgression, all of it must be dragged into light. This is why redemption feels like violence from the perspective of the ego. The ego experiences truth as attack because truth refuses to let it remain central. Yet this violence is the only path out of inner decomposition. The soul cannot be healed while still kneeling before its own pride. It cannot be restored while preserving the right to remain self-enthroned. Dostoevsky understands that the deepest slavery is not external coercion, but inner captivity to the false self. A man may call that captivity identity. He may call it realism. He may call it dignity. But if he cannot repent, he is not free. If he cannot bow before truth, he is not whole. If he cannot receive mercy without using mercy as permission to continue rotting, he has not yet entered the narrow gate of transformation. This is why suffering, in the final Dostoevskian sense, is not automatically holy, but it can become revelatory. It can strip illusion. It can expose dependence. It can break the arrogant fiction of self-sufficiency. Not every wound purifies. Some wounds poison. But when suffering is met by truth and born without self-deception, it can become the place where the old self finally collapses. Then pain is no longer only punishment or absurdity. It becomes the furnace in which the divided soul is forced to choose whether it will harden into resentment or soften into repentance. Repentance itself is often misunderstood. It is not self-hatred for its own sake. Dostoevsky never glorifies humiliation as spectacle. Real repentance is not the enjoyment of one's own degradation. It is the recovery of moral reality. It is the return of proportion. The soul no longer calls darkness light. It no longer names bondage freedom. It no longer mistakes wounded pride for uniqueness. It sees, and in seeing, it suffers. But this suffering is cleaner than the old corruption because it no longer protects the lie. It is the pain of reality re-entering the person. That is why redemption in Dostoevsky is inseparable from humility. Humility is not timidity. It is not weakness. It is the courage to stop lying about one's place in the universe. It is the end of the fantasy that I am exceptional enough to escape moral law, superior enough to define truth for myself, injured enough to earn exemption from conscience. Humility restores the soul to reality. It accepts dependence. It accepts finitude. It accepts that love cannot be possessed by force and meaning cannot be manufactured by ego. Only the humble soul can receive grace, because only the humble soul has stopped trying to be its own God. And still, none of this becomes fully complete at the level of individual healing alone. Because once a person begins to rise from inner ruin, another demand emerges with greater force. He must now ask what kind of life can sustain truth after confession, humility after pride, love after guilt, and faith after revolt, for the healed soul cannot remain turned inward forever without risking a fall back into itself. And that is where Dostoevsky's vision stops being merely personal and becomes civilizational. A soul may confess, repent, suffer, and begin to rise from its own ruins, but if it returns to a world built on vanity, domination, spectacle, and spiritual amnesia, the old sickness waits again at the door. Redemption cannot remain a private mood. It must become a way of living inside history without surrendering to history's corruption. The question is no longer whether one broken person can be restored. The question is whether truth can survive in a culture trained to reward masks, whether humility can endure in a world organized around self-assertion, whether love can remain morally serious when everything around it demands performance instead of sacrifice. Dostoevsky understood that the modern crisis is never only individual. The person suffers inwardly, yes, but the soul is always suffering inside an age, and an age teaches its own liturgy. It teaches what to admire, what to fear, what to mock, what to consume, what to worship. A civilization may not kneel in churches, yet it still kneels. It kneels before power, novelty, speed, desire, ideology, money, prestige, comfort, and the endless need to appear significant. This is why moral struggle cannot be sealed off inside private conscience. The self is always being pressed by invisible catechisms. It is being trained daily into a form of love or a form of servitude. Dostoevsky saw that one of the deepest lies of modern life is the belief that spiritual neutrality is possible. It is not. A person who is not consciously ordering his soul will still be ordered by something else. Appetite will order it. Fear will order it. Public opinion will order it. Resentment will order it. The need for recognition will order it. The self cannot remain empty and sovereign at once. It will serve. The only real question is what it will serve and whether that service elevates the person into truth or deforms him into a more efficient slave. This is why freedom after repentance becomes more demanding, not less. Once the soul has seen its own capacity for self-deception, it can no longer live casually. It can no longer pretend that choices are harmless fragments. It knows now that habit shapes conscience, that repeated compromises educate desire, that every act either strengthens the inner orientation toward truth or weakens it. Freedom is no longer romantic. It is disciplined. It is no longer the thrill of choosing. It is the burden of remaining aligned with what one has seen. A person who has passed through ruin and found even a fragment of moral light cannot return innocently to the old fragmentation. He must build a life capable of carrying what he now knows. That life, in Dostoevsky, is never built on self-worship. The redeemed soul does not become fascinated with its own transformation. That would only be another form of pride. The danger after repentance is subtle. The ego can take ownership of humility. It can turn suffering into distinction. It can convert moral awakening into hidden superiority. A man may confess yesterday and begin judging others tomorrow with twice the cruelty because he now imagines himself clean. Dostoevsky knows this danger well. That is why true renewal must move beyond self-absorption altogether. It must become service. It must become responsibility, carried without vanity. It must become love, enacted in ordinary fidelity. This is where Alyosha Karamazov begins to matter with extraordinary force. He is not important because he escapes the darkness others face. He is important because he walks through darkness without surrendering his center. He does not live in denial of evil. He has seen enough suffering, enough corruption, enough absurdity to justify cynicism. Yet he resists cynicism not because he is simple, but because he is spiritually disciplined against despair. Through him, Dostoevsky offers a different model of strength. Not the brilliance that dissects everything and remains sterile. Not the pride that rebels and burns itself alive. Not the purity that stands radiant yet wounded in tragic isolation. Alyosha represents the soul trying to remain open to grace while staying inside the broken human world. That matters because the future of the soul depends on whether moral truth can become communal rather than merely interior. Alyosha listens. He remembers. He bears others without theatricality. He does not dominate the room. He does not seduce through ideas. He does something far rarer. He preserves a space where the human person can still be approached as sacred. In a world that turns people into instruments, rivals, abstractions, and objects of use, such preservation is already resistance. Dostoevsky is saying that spiritual life survives not only through grand martyrdoms or dramatic confessions, but through the quiet labor of refusing to let another soul become unreal to me. Modern life makes this nearly impossible. It trains abstraction at scale. People are encountered as categories, audiences, statistics, enemies, brands, and tools for self-construction. Attention is fragmented. Memory is shallow. The language of care is everywhere, but actual reverence is rare. Under such conditions, conscience becomes unstable because the person no longer feels the weight of another's presence. He reacts, comments, consumes, judges, and moves on. But moral reality cannot survive that pace. A soul that never lingers before another person's suffering becomes thin. A society that loses reverence for personhood will still talk about values, but its speech will float above an inner vacuum. This is why Dostoevsky's final challenge is so severe. He is not asking whether we agree with certain doctrines. He is asking whether we are capable of becoming the kind of beings for whom truth is livable. Can we endure freedom without fleeing into appetite? Can we endure suffering without weaponizing it? Can we endure guilt without collapsing into self-hatred? Can we endure innocence violated without turning either nihilistic or cruel? Can we endure love without converting it into control? These are not abstract questions. They define whether civilization remains human or becomes technically advanced and spiritually dead. And here the role of memory becomes crucial. Dostoevsky never treats memory as sentimental recollection. Memory is moral continuity. It keeps the soul from dissolving into the present pressure of appetite and noise. To remember suffering truthfully is to resist triviality. To remember grace truthfully is to resist despair. To remember one's own guilt truthfully is to resist pride. To remember another person as more than the worst thing he has done is to resist the cruelty of final reduction. A culture without deep memory becomes manipulable because it lives only by immediate sensation. An individual without deep memory becomes unstable because every impulse feels absolute. Memory anchors conscience against both chaos and spectacle. This is why children matter so much in the Dostoevskian world, and not only because innocence accused the world earlier. They matter because they reveal what the soul is before sophistication corrupts it fully. They stand close to wonder, closeness, trust, and the need for meaning uncorrupted by performance. To betray that dimension of human life is not only to harm the weak, it is to betray the future of moral reality itself. A civilization that cannot protect innocence will eventually lose the capacity to recognize goodness even in adults. It will raise generations fluent in language and starving in soul. So the answer Dostoevsky pushes toward is severe but clear. The human future depends on whether love can become a form of shared moral existence rather than private emotion. Not love as indulgence, not love as identity, not love as rhetoric, love as burden, love as truth-telling, love as memory, love as patient regard for the dignity of souls in danger of destroying themselves and each other. Only such love can carry freedom without collapsing into chaos. Only such love can face guilt without lying. Only such love can honor innocence without making its suffering meaningless. Only such love can build a life after confession that does not slide back into worship of the self. And once that demand is seen clearly, one last tension begins to tighten with absolute force, because even a soul committed to love, memory, humility, and responsibility must still stand before the final question. No culture, no philosophy, and no private discipline can evade forever. The question of whether this struggle points only to noble endurance inside a broken world, or to a reality beyond the world in which truth, justice, and mercy are not merely desired, but fulfilled. And that final question is where Dostoevsky becomes impossible to domesticate. He does not permit the human struggle to end in noble exhaustion. He does not allow conscience, suffering, guilt, innocence, and love to remain suspended forever inside a universe that never answers them. He pushes all moral experience toward an edge where one must decide whether the deepest cries of the soul are illusions produced by biological pain or signs that human existence is structured toward transcendence. This is not a decorative religious addition. It is the point at which every previous tension either breaks apart or gathers into meaning. For if there is no reality beyond the visible order, then freedom becomes a tragic accident, conscience becomes an evolutionary inconvenience, innocence becomes meaningless vulnerability, and love becomes a beautiful but temporary revolt against an indifferent world. Dostoevsky saw this with brutal precision. He knew that man cannot live for long on psychological fragments alone. A person may speak about ethics, dignity, beauty, and compassion, but if the universe itself remains morally deaf, then those words are always standing on threatened ground. They may continue for a time, through habit, through culture, through inherited memory. But the deeper the mind thinks, the more severe the problem becomes. Why should I suffer for truth if truth has no final home? Why should I bear guilt honestly if guilt is only a malfunction of conditioning? Why should I revere innocence if innocence is only temporary weakness before annihilation? Why should I choose love when power is more effective and death erases both the victim and the tyrant alike? This is why Dostoevsky's religious vision is never sentimental consolation. It is metaphysical necessity. Not necessity in the sense that he builds a cold proof. He is doing something more dangerous. He is showing that the human soul, if it follows its own deepest experiences honestly, is driven toward the question of God, because without that horizon, its own moral life begins to collapse under its own weight. The longing for justice, the revolt against innocent suffering, the torment of guilt, the hunger for redemption, the reverence for purity, all these point beyond utility. They are not neatly explained by survival. They are signs of a creature not fully at home in material closure. Ivan Karamazov stands at the center of this fire. He is too intelligent for shallow piety, too morally serious for easy atheism, and too wounded by the spectacle of suffering to accept religious language without trial. Through him, Dostoevsky stages one of the most devastating confrontations in literature. Ivan does not merely doubt doctrines. He places existence itself on trial. He demands to know whether any eternal harmony can justify temporal horror. He insists that if God exists, then God must answer not to abstract theology, but to the crushed innocent, the humiliated child, the violated weak. This is what gives his rebellion force. It is not vanity disguised as intellect. It is moral outrage refusing to kneel cheaply. And yet Ivan also reveals the danger of revolt severed from transcendence. A man may reject God in the name of justice, but once transcendence is denied, justice itself begins to lose its foundation. The protest remains emotionally powerful, but metaphysically unstable. For if there is no source of value beyond human assertion, then outrage becomes intensity without anchor. One person protests cruelty, another celebrates it. One reveres innocence, another exploits it. On what ground can the difference finally stand if the universe itself offers no final distinction between saint and criminal? This is where Dostoevsky becomes merciless again. He shows that rebellion against God may preserve moral passion for a time, but it often borrows from the very spiritual inheritance it is trying to destroy. That is why the death of transcendence does not produce clean liberation. It produces vertigo. Once man becomes the highest court, he discovers that he is unfit for the throne. He is too divided, too proud, too wounded, too hungry for power, too susceptible to self-deception. The very creature who wants to judge the cosmos cannot govern his own appetites without contradiction. Dostoevsky knew that when God is removed, man does not become purely rational. He becomes spiritually unbounded. And what enters that vacuum is not peaceful autonomy, but the struggle of rival wills, rival gods, rival ideologies, rival forms of domination disguised as freedom. This is why transcendence matters in Dostoevsky, not as escape from life, but as the only horizon wide enough to preserve life's moral seriousness. If there is a reality beyond death in which truth is not erased, then suffering is no longer sealed inside absurdity. If there is a justice beyond history, then innocence is not finally abandoned to the accident of time. If there is mercy beyond human calculation, then guilt is not forced to choose between denial and despair. If there is divine love, then repentance is not merely psychological rearrangement, but participation in a reality stronger than corruption. Without this, every moral victory remains fragile, local, and threatened by the grave. Modern culture still resists this with nervous energy. It wants the fruits of transcendence without transcendence itself. It wants dignity without sacred origin. It wants justice without eternal measure. It wants compassion without metaphysical obligation. It wants meaning without worship. But these borrowed lights grow dim over time. Once value is detached from any source deeper than preference, it becomes negotiable. Once the human being is no longer seen as bearing eternal weight, he becomes easier to classify, use, manage, seduce, and discard. The language of rights may remain, but the inner fire that made rights sacred begins to cool. Dostoevsky therefore presses the issue inwardly, rather than institutionally. He asks what kind of being man becomes when he no longer lives before eternity. The answer is severe. He becomes flatter, more anxious, more performative, more vulnerable to ideologies that promise meaning through collective power, more susceptible to despair because suffering no longer points beyond itself, more tempted by cruelty because if there is no final judgment, then domination begins to feel increasingly reasonable. The disappearance of transcendence does not free the soul from burden. It removes the sky and leaves the burden heavier. And still, Dostoevsky does not argue for faith as comfort. Faith in his world is not anesthesia. It is risk. It is the courage to trust that reality is morally grounded even when history screams otherwise. It is the refusal to reduce existence to what pain can currently prove. It is the decision to live as though truth, mercy, and love are not private fantasies, but revelations of what is deepest in being itself. That trust does not erase the arguments of rebellion. It carries them through fire. It does not deny the scandal. It refuses to let the scandal become the final word. This is why the figure of Christ stands behind Dostoevsky's entire moral universe, even when not constantly named. Not as a decorative symbol of religion, but as the answer to the full severity of the human condition. In Christ, innocence suffers without becoming hatred. Freedom obeys without becoming slavery. Love descends into humiliation without surrendering truth. Guilt is faced without being trivialized. Evil is unmasked without being granted ultimate sovereignty. This is crucial. The answer to darkness is not explanation. It is incarnation, not a theory above the abyss, but a presence entering it. That is the only kind of answer proportionate to the wound Dostoevsky has spent all his pages opening. And yet even here, belief is not finished. The soul must still decide whether it can live inside this horizon rather than merely admire it. It must decide whether transcendence will remain an idea or become a demand on conduct, memory, sacrifice, humility, and love. For the question of God, once honestly faced, no longer remains safely in philosophy. It descends into daily existence and asks whether a human being can bear to live as though eternity is already watching every hidden movement of the heart. And that is where Dostoevsky's philosophy stops being a vision and becomes a verdict. If eternity is watching every hidden movement of the heart, then nothing remains trivial. No thought is only a thought. No compromise is only temporary. No act of cruelty disappears because society forgets it. No private lie stays buried just because language is skillful enough to cover it. The human being stands exposed, not merely before history, not merely before other people, but before a reality that cannot be deceived. This is the final pressure of Dostoevsky's world. Man is not only free, he is answerable. And answerability is what gives every choice its full metaphysical weight. Modern life is built to help us forget this. It trains distraction with industrial efficiency. It floods the mind with noise, so conscience never reaches full volume. It teaches speed, reaction, self-invention, self-display, and moral improvisation. It encourages a life lived on the surface where one can move from appetite to appetite without ever descending into judgment. But Dostoevsky tears through this surface with savage force. He insists that the soul does not become less real because it is ignored. Conscience does not die because one becomes busy. The hidden life does not vanish because the public life becomes impressive. The inward person remains, and it is there that destiny is formed. That is why he places such terrible emphasis on the unseen. A civilization may still function while inwardly rotting. A person may still appear successful while spiritually collapsing. One may be admired, envied, desired, even celebrated, and still be moving toward inner disintegration with every day that passes. Dostoevsky understood that external order can coexist with moral decay for a long time. The catastrophe arrives later. It arrives when the accumulated lies inside a person or a culture can no longer be held together by performance. Then what was hidden becomes visible. Then what was private becomes historical. Then the secret disease acquires public form. This is why judgment in Dostoevsky is not merely something that happens after death. Judgment is already entering life through consequence, memory, guilt, fragmentation, and the corruption of love. A man who lies repeatedly does not simply commit isolated lies. He becomes less able to stand in truth. A woman who trains herself in contempt does not merely have contemptuous moments. She becomes unable to receive tenderness without suspicion. A culture that rewards vanity does not merely produce vain individuals. It creates conditions under which sincerity begins to look weak and deception begins to look intelligent. Judgment is already unfolding wherever a soul is shaped by what it worships. That is the key. Every soul becomes like its object of worship. This is one of Dostoevsky's deepest and most merciless insights. Worship here does not only mean religion in the narrow sense. It means whatever the person treats as ultimate. Power can become worship. Desire can become worship. Reason can become worship. Injury can become worship. The self can become worship. And whatever is enthroned at the center begins to reorder perception, desire, and action around itself. If power is God, then love becomes weakness. If desire is God, then fidelity becomes suffocation. If the self is God, then every limit becomes insult. This is how damnation begins long before any final sentence is spoken. It begins as misdirected devotion. Dostoevsky saw that the human being cannot survive worshiping himself. The self is too unstable, too contradictory, too hungry, too wounded to bear that burden. Once the ego becomes ultimate, it starts devouring everything around it. Relationships become fuel, morality becomes strategy, freedom becomes self-excuse, suffering becomes entitlement, thought becomes weapon. At first this can feel exhilarating. The person imagines he has become sovereign. In truth, he has become more enslaved than ever. because nothing is more tyrannical than a self with no law above it. The unruled ego does not create greatness. It creates spiritual suffocation. This is why Dostoevsky's final demand is not merely faith, but reordering. The soul must be turned, not decorated, not entertained, not morally accessorized. Turned. It must leave behind the secret throne where it has been kneeling before its own will. It must learn obedience, not as humiliation by an external force, but as liberation from the inner despot that has been governing badly all along. This is where modern man recoils. He wants inspiration without surrender. He wants depth without repentance. He wants transcendence without obedience. But Dostoevsky offers no such compromise. To live truthfully, one must step down from self-sovereignty. And yet this stepping down is not the destruction of personhood. It is its rescue. The soul finally begins to breathe when it no longer has to fabricate itself as absolute. It can confess because its existence no longer depends on appearing spotless. It can love because it no longer needs to convert every encounter into self-defense. It can suffer without theatricality because suffering no longer functions as proof of uniqueness. It can remember without drowning because memory is no longer serving vanity. This is the paradox Dostoevsky never stops pressing. The human being becomes most fully himself only after abandoning the fantasy of being his own God. That abandonment gives ordinary life a terrifying seriousness. The smallest gestures now matter. How one speaks when irritated matters. What one permits in fantasy matters. Whether one humiliates another person for private satisfaction matters. Whether one keeps faith when no applause follows matters. Whether one remains truthful when deceit would be more profitable matters. A modern mind trained to think in scale misses this. It looks for great events, public crises, historical turning points. Dostoevsky looks lower and deeper. He knows that whole destinies are built from repeated hidden choices that seem too small to notice until character has already been formed. This is why spiritual life in his vision is never escape from the world. It is combat inside the world at the level where history is born, the level of motive, attention, reverence, and will. The battle is not first between parties, classes, or systems. It is between truth and falsehood inside the person. Every ideology that forgets this becomes dangerous because it tries to solve externally what is still festering inwardly. That is why so many revolutions rot. They overthrow structures while leaving the heart untouched. Then the old darkness reappears wearing new clothes. The banner changes. The soul underneath does not. Dostoevsky's severity therefore leads to an unexpected kind of hope. Not optimism. Never optimism. Optimism assumes things will improve because history advances or institutions refine themselves. He trusts no such easy movement. His hope is harder. It rests on the belief that no soul is reducible to its worst corruption while breath remains, and no civilization is saved by brilliance if it loses reverence for the human person. This hope does not flatter. It demands vigilance. It demands humility. It demands suffering carried truthfully. It demands love that refuses both sentimentality and cruelty. It demands a life lived as though every inward act is already participating in eternity. That is why the final Dostoevskian human being is not the triumphant hero of modern fantasies. He is more fragile and more formidable than that. He knows what lives in him. He knows his freedom can rot into rebellion, his intelligence into pride, his suffering into poison, his love into possession, his ideals into cruelty. He knows this because he has seen the abyss honestly. But he also knows that truth can still be chosen, that repentance is still possible, that grace is not exhausted, that innocence can still be protected, that memory can still resist nihilism, and that the soul is not abandoned simply because the battle is severe. He walks, therefore, without illusion, but not without light. And once a person begins to live under that light, another task emerges with its own weight, because the question is no longer only what Dostoevsky revealed about freedom, suffering, evil, innocence, love, and God, but what all of it finally says about us now, here, inside the polished chaos of modern life that still calls itself advanced while hiding the same ancient war inside the human heart. Man is not a solved creature. He is a battlefield. That is the truth Dostoevsky leaves behind, like a wound that never fully closes. He does not offer a comfortable philosophy of human nature. He offers a ruthless revelation. The human being is free, yet divided, capable of love, yet drawn to destruction, hungry for God, yet always tempted to kneel before pride, power, or despair. In that contradiction, Dostoevsky finds the real drama of existence, not in politics first, not in history first, but in the soul. What he reveals is severe. No system can save a person from himself. No ideology can carry the burden of conscience. No rational structure can erase guilt, heal innocence violated, or force the heart into goodness. The deepest struggle is always inward. It is the struggle between truth and self-deception, love and domination, humility and pride, faith and revolt. And that struggle does not belong only to 19th century Russia. It belongs to every age that calls itself advanced while remaining spiritually fractured. This is why suffering, faith, and love stand at the center of Dostoevsky's vision. Suffering strips illusion. Faith refuses to let darkness become final. Love breaks the isolation in which the soul decays. Together, they do not make life easier, they make it real. They force man to confront what he is without anesthetic, and what he still might become if he does not flee from truth. Redemption in this world is never automatic. It is chosen, it is suffered, it is lived. And that is Dostoevsky's final demand. Look into your own abyss. Stop blaming the world for every shadow you secretly protect. Stop expecting institutions, theories, or progress to do the work of the soul. The greatest war is not out there. It is within. And the fate of man begins at the exact moment he stops running from that fact.